My Govanen. Welcome to the Tolkien Lore Channel. I'm the Tolkien Geek, and in the spirit of New Year, New You, I have grown a beard, and I'm keeping it. So that out of the way, I should also mention that I am going to be linking to a interview that I did with the Marquette University people. You may remember a while back I mentioned that the Marquette University was doing an oral history project. My interview has been available for a while now, and I've been posting it in my links, but I had so many videos that were pre-done that I hadn't had a chance to mention it in a video. Now I'm mentioning it. You can see, if you haven't already, that my interview is linked to in the description below in case you've missed that. So that out of the way, the topic of this particular video is the Children of Hurin, which I've had for a long time, longer than I've had this channel, and that's why I haven't done this book review before, because as I was doing the book reviews, I did the Beren and Luthien and the Fall of Gondolin ones as they came out, whereas this one I had for a long time, and I'd actually loaned it to my brother, who had it for a while, and I forgot I had even loaned it to him, but now I have it back, and I have read it again, and I am ready to do a book review, so let's take a look at this thing. So the first thing to note about the Children of Hurin, it is very unlike the Beren and Luthien and Fall of Gondolin books that have come out more recently, in that the Children of Hurin is much more of a just straight, consistent narrative. There are other parts to the book, but the main point is not like the Beren and Luthien and Fall of Gondolin to show the progression of the story as Tolkien changed his conception of it and rewrote it, but to give the most coherent, complete narrative possible with the most up-to-date stuff that Tolkien ever wrote. And in this regard, it's my favorite of the three of the Great Tales books, because it does give you a really good fleshed out story. And in fact, it's long enough that it really does kind of stand on its own as a novel. That's one of the benefits of it, is it's Silmarillion material, but it's at much more of a granular level, much more like a Lord of the Rings style, because it's written in a much more detailed way, and therefore it's much easier to read for a typical audience, because it's not the Silmarillion high language all the time and that sort of thing. But it has various interesting aspects to compare with the Silmarillion version of the story of Turin Turambar. And so I'm going to spend a little time talking about that, and a little bit of time also talking about other relations it has to other things, and then also talk about other parts of the book that are not the narrative itself. So first of all, let's look at the comparison of this to the Silmarillion version of the story. Obviously, of course, we get a lot of detail in this version that we don't get in the Silmarillion, and part of this, I should also mention, is from the Unfinished Tales. In the Unfinished Tales, Christopher Tolkien published a rather lengthy text called the Narn I Hurin, which is literally translated just the tale of the Children of Hurin, and it's basically the source from which most of this book is drawn. But in the Unfinished Tales, it was in the Unfinished Tales, obviously, because Tolkien never finished the Narn version of the story. And so some of the elements in this particular volume are actually drawn from the later Silmarillion writings and that sort of thing, rather than the more completed but unfinished Narn. So there's a lot of that going on. A lot of the information and material that you can get in this book is also in the Unfinished Tales. So if you already have the Unfinished Tales and you already have the Silmarillion, you pretty much have all of this book for the most part, with probably a handful of things that aren't there. But you know, if you really want just the one coherent narrative, this is the book to get. And there's a few different respects in which the differences really stand out, at least to me, as I reread it. For one, there are a number of additional named characters. For instance, when Turin is still a boy in Hithlum, his father has a serving man working for him who is named Sador, and who Turin names Hoppafoot, or Labadal in the Elvish. And this is not out of scorn. It's the guy actually has a wound in his foot and he limps, so he can't really walk normally. But it tells us that Turin names him this not out of scorn or anything, but actually more out of pity and friendship. And we get a lot of conversations between Turin and Labadal, or Sador. And a lot of these conversations end up having kind of prescient, you know, value for Turin's later life, and I don't want to get into the details because you really should read it for yourself. There's also, during his stay in Doriath, a character named Nellas, who is a female elf who befriends Turin in his younger days, and then ends up being one of the key witnesses who comes before Thingol after Turin kills Cyros, the elf who makes fun of him and his family. He doesn't directly kill them, but you know what I mean, if you know the story. Anyway, Nellis ends up being the witness who basically proves, no, Turin didn't kill this guy out of malice. He was actually attacked by the other guy. And so, I mean, there's a lot of stuff like that. And even during his stay with the outlaws, we get 2 or 3 of the outlaws that have their own names and have characters that develop. And Turin's relationship with the outlaws is a lot more interesting because of this, because he has, you know, relationships with this one guy who is at first the leader, and then he ends up killing him kind of in an accident. And that in itself ends up being an interesting episode, which gives us a little more view into Turin's character. But basically, there's just a lot of different characters that pop up that we don't really see because we don't have that granular level in the Silmarillion. So back to that issue of him accidentally killing the other leader, here we get another aspect that's different, because in the Silmarillion version, we do get aspects of Turin's character, but rarely at a very granular level. So we get, you know, brief references to his character, and we get interesting things that we know about him just because of the things that he does. But here we see an example, when he kills this guy, another guy was running up behind, and he comes up and sees that Turin's killed him, and he's like, "What'd you do that for?" And Turin, instead of basically saying, well, he just came on me out of the woods and I just didn't know who he was and it was too late, he actually kind of plays it up like he killed him so as to become the chief of the outlaws. And this is a really interesting way of getting a view into Turin's character, because we rarely get something that specific of an instance in the Silmarillion where we can really get a look at what Turin is thinking or what he's doing. And here we actually get a pretty profound, you know, it doesn't tell us exactly what Turin has in his head, but what he says gives us a pretty good idea of what he must be thinking, because it's like there's only so many reasons why he would play it that way. And there are other instances like this as well in the story where we get, you know, instances of him doing something specific or interacting with other characters in specific ways that give us more detail and more interesting looks into what he's got going on in his head. Finally, another difference between this and the Silmarillion version is the fact that we get a lot more detail on his character in ways that either kind of exemplify, and by character I don't mean his personality so much as his character development, that exemplify either the Curse of Morgoth or the playing out of his own personality. So we get references to facts that, you know, things that he begins rarely go well, even in his youth. Like he'll try to make things but then break them because he doesn't know his own strength, or, you know, different things like that. He rarely gets what he wants in life. He makes friends seldom because he's kind of reclusive. You know, just a lot of different little aspects of his personality that, you know, we see over the course of his character development, and it enhances the whole idea in the Turin Turambar story of saying, you know, is this the Curse of Morgoth at play, or is this just who Turin is? You know, because that's always an element in the Turin Turambar story, is how much of this is Morgoth and how much of this is just Turin's own stupidity or his own fault, or, you know, just his own rashness. It's often difficult to draw that line, and here that line gets even more fuzzy, but it also gets more interesting because of all the different things that we see about him that really kind of play along that line, that we can say, well, is this on this side or that side of the line? So there's a lot of that too. There is actually one more thing about the difference between this and the Silmarillion story I should mention. Because of the way the Turin Turambar story is set in the Silmarillion, where it happens after the chapter covering the Nirnaeth Arnodiad and the capture of Hurin, it gives us a little bit of a prologue sort of telling about the Nirnaeth Arnodiad and the capture of Hurin and all that stuff at the beginning of the narrative. So we have a little bit more context than just chapter 21 of the Silmarillion. I think it's chapter 21. So that's kind of the last major difference between this and the Silmarillion that's really worth mentioning. Another point about this book is the additional material included. And the main point here, there is an introduction which kind of sets up for us what we're about to get, and explains why Christopher Tolkien endeavored to put this volume together. And then the final part of the book, well, not quite the final part, but the last major part of the book is an appendix, which basically kind of goes through the textual history of the different versions of the story, including the lay of the Children of Hurin that you can find in the Lays of Beleriand. And in this particular part of the book, Tolkien gives kind of the same thing that he does in the Beren and Luthien and Fall of Gondolin volumes, but he does it on a much shorter scale, obviously, and he doesn't give tons of different amounts of material in showing the differences between. He does give some examples, but they're fairly short, and they tend to be, he keeps it all pretty brief and gives more just an overview as opposed to really laying out all the different versions in a lot of detail. So that's interesting for those of us who want to know more about Tolkien's process in writing and developing these stories. But if you're just interested in the story itself, you can easily skip it. It's really not important. I wouldn't recommend skipping the introduction. It's kind of important to understanding the book. Not super important. I mean, you could just read the narrative by itself and be fine, but I would definitely read the introduction anyway. The appendix, if you're interested in all of that, really more technical stuff, you can definitely read. There's also a glossary of names or an index of names, and there's a few other parts of the book that don't really merit mentioning in terms of the value of the book itself, because it's mostly there as an aid to people who are not introduced already to the stories and the first age of Middle-earth, because that's really the point of this book, is kind of an introduction to the first age without having to dig into the Silmarillion. Christopher Tolkien basically says that in his introduction. The purpose of this book is basically to give some people a doorway into the Silmarillion stories that isn't quite as difficult or as imposing as the Silmarillion itself, because this is shorter, it's just one narrative, it's a lot more granular along the style of the version that we get in the Lord of the Rings as opposed to what you get in the Silmarillion, and it's much more easy to read for that reason. I will say along those lines, though, you can tell in places where Christopher Tolkien has kind of been forced to cobble things together a bit, because if you know your Silmarillion and you read this, you will notice things that are basically lifted straight out of the Silmarillion, and it's usually at a place where the Narn y Hurin just doesn't cover that material, and so you'll get, a reference, towards the end. I remember there being a paragraph it sounds almost exactly like it was just taken straight out of the Silmarillion, because the Narn never got that far. And so it's interesting when you already know the history and you really know your Silmarillion. Of course, I've read the Silmarillion pretty recently before I read this. If you really know your stuff, you can spot that a little easier. But even if not, you can kind of tell, because the style will kind of change a little bit. It'll become a lot more concise, summarized, a lot less granular. And it's interesting to see that from that point of view, because you can tell what Christopher's doing is he's, having to work with what he has, and sometimes he doesn't have the fleshed out narrative to work with. So that's an interesting point just to notice in the book. But if you're not paying attention to it, you might miss it, and you might not notice, and you might not care. Either way, the story as told in this book is amazing. I mean, if you enjoy the Silmarillion version, then this is way better, because it gives you so many different things to work with in terms of the plot and storytelling and ways that you can look at it. And one of those, for instance, is the way that the additional character of Sodor, Labadal, ends up having kind of a parallel at the very end with Brondir, because Turin treats Labadal or Sodor with a lot of pity and actually kind of looks up to him in some ways. And then at the end, Brondir, who is also lame, for different reasons, Turin basically just scorns, because by that point in the story, he has completely changed in his character. And, the way that those two kind of offset each other, you get a really significant view into what's happened to Turin over time. And it makes for a great parallel in the story. And that's not the only one. It's just a really good example. So this particular version of the Turin story is definitely one you should pick up if you have any interest in the First Age. whether you've read the Silmarillion or not. It's just really great writing, some of Tolkien's best work ever. I mean, pretty much all of his late version writings of these great tales are just amazing, and this is no exception. And of course, the Turin story is just kind of special on its own terms because it's such a unique aspect of the Silmarillion series. But it's just, you just got to read this one. If you read nothing else from the First Age, pick up this book. So that's pretty much my review of the Children of Hurin. Like I said, do pick up this book. It's absolutely amazing. If you enjoy the video, please do give it a thumbs up and share it around. You can follow me on Twitter at JRRTLore for occasional Tolkien trivia questions, which I will be getting back to a little more now that the holidays are over. And of course, you can also subscribe to the channel here. You can find 2 of my previous videos here, and you can support the channel here. Until the next time, I'm the Tolkien Geek, signing out for the Tolkien Lore channel. Namaste.